used to believe silence was strength, that if I stayed calm, stayed useful, stayed reasonable, things would eventually balance out. Families reward loyalty, I told myself. Patience gets noticed. Love evens the score. I believed that right up until the moment my father's hand struck my face in front of 200 wedding guests, and the sound echoed louder than the music, louder than the applause, louder than every lie I had ever swallowed to keep the peace. It happened at my stepsister's wedding, under crystal chandeliers and soft white lights, the kind of place people book to pretend their lives are flawless. He didn't slap me because I was rude. He slapped me because I said no. No to handing over the penthouse I bought with my own money. No to being quietly erased so his new family could look complete. No to pretending this was love instead of theft dressed up as tradition. When his palm connected with my cheek, I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I felt something cleaner than anger settle into my chest. Clarity. The kind that burns away excuses in seconds. He leaned close afterward, breath tight with authority, and said, "Don't make a scene. This is family business." I remember thinking how strange it was that family business always seemed to cost me something and pay everyone else in comfort. Around us, people froze. Some looked away. Some pretended not to notice. My stepsister didn't turn around at all. The band kept playing. The wedding went on. And in that moment, I understood exactly who I was to them. Not a daughter, not a sister, a resource, a line item, a problem to be managed. If you want the full truth, hit like so this story reaches more people, because silence is how this kind of thing survives. I smiled at my father, not kindly, not cruelly, just honestly, and I realized that refusing the penthouse was the smallest act of defiance I would ever make. What came next would be deliberate, quiet, and impossible to ignore. People like to imagine betrayal as loud, screaming matches, doors slammed, tears soaking into expensive carpets. But real betrayal is often polished. It smiles at you over champagne flutes. It wears formal clothes and calls itself concern. As I stood there with my cheeks still warm, I looked around the room and saw the pattern I'd spent years refusing to name. My father stood straight, already certain the moment would pass. My stepmother hovered nearby, lips pressed thin, not shocked, just annoyed that the exchange had been so public. This was supposed to happen later, somewhere private, somewhere easier to control. My stepsister was at the center of it all, glowing in white, laughing as if nothing in the world could touch her. She de-learned early what I learned late. In this family, attention was currency and compliance was the price of peace. I excused myself before anyone could pull me aside to explain why I should understand. The hallway outside the ballroom felt cooler, quieter. My reflection in a mirror caught me off guard. I looked composed. No tears, no trembling hands, just a woman in a tailored dress who had finally reached the end of her tolerance. I remembered every time I'd helped cover a shortfall. Every time I'd been told I was strong, independent, capable, as if those words were compliments instead of instructions. Strong meant expendable. Independent meant unsupported. Capable meant responsible for everyone else's comfort. My phone buzzed in my hand, a message from my father already reframing the story. "We'll talk later, you embarrassed me." Not you hurt me, not you crossed a line, just embarrassment. Reputation over relationship always. I typed nothing back. For the first time in my life, I let the silence stand. As I walked toward the exit, heels steady on marble, I wasn't running away. I was stepping out of a role I'd never agreed to play, and somewhere between the valet stand and the open night air, I made a quiet decision. I would not argue. I would not plead. I would let actions speak in a language they could not interrupt. The drive home felt unreal, city lights streaking past like they belonged to someone else's life. I replayed the moment over and over, not the slap itself, but what came before it. The assumption, the certainty that I would fold. My father had always spoken about my penthouse as if it were temporary, a placeholder until someone more deserving needed it. He never said it outright, but it lived in the way he asked questions. "You're hardly ever there, right? It's a lot of space for one person. Family should share what they have." He'd been planting that seed for years, watering it with guilt, trimming it with praise. I parked in my building's underground garage and sat there longer than necessary, engine off, listening to the quiet hum of concrete and distance. This place wasn't a symbol to me. It was safety. It was the first thing I owned outright, earned without favors, without strings. I'd worked late nights, taken risks, said no to comfort so I could say yes to freedom. And they wanted it because it proved I didn't need them anymore. That was the real offense. Upstairs, I poured a glass of water and pressed it to my cheek, not because it hurt, but because the ritual grounded me. My phone lit up again. This time it was my stepsister. Dad didn't mean it like that. You know how stressed he is. Can we talk tomorrow? The message was soft, reasonable, carefully worded to make me the problem if I refused. I stared at it for a long moment, then set the phone face down. Some conversations only exist to move you backward. If you believe she deserved justice, comment respect below. Not revenge, respect. Because what they had taken wasn't property, it was consent, and I had just withdrawn it. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Not because I was spiraling, but because my mind felt sharper than it had in years. I walked through my penthouse slowly, noticing details I usually rushed past. The way the city reflected in the windows, the faint creak of the floor near the balcony doors. This space held my choices, my work, my patience. It had never held their permission. I realized how carefully I'd protected everyone else's comfort while leaving my own boundaries unguarded. Around midnight, I opened my laptop and began reviewing documents I hadn't touched in months. Deeds, insurance records, access logs, not out of paranoia but preparedness. Something in my father's confidence unsettled me. He hadn't demanded, he'd expected. That kind of expectation usually comes from rehearsal, from conversations I wasn't part of. I checked the building's resident portal, half curious, half cautious. At first, everything looked normal. Then I saw it. A pending request to add an additional resident. My stepsister's name, submitted earlier that afternoon, while I was still at the wedding. I didn't feel rage. I felt confirmed. They hadn't reacted to my refusal. They'd planned around it. I closed the laptop and leaned back, letting the reality settle. This wasn't an argument that got out of hand. It was an operation that hit resistance. And resistance to people like them wasn't a boundary. It was a challenge. I stood up and went to the balcony, letting the cool air steady me. Somewhere below, traffic moved like nothing had changed. I understood then that if I handled this emotionally, I'd lose. But if I handled it methodically, I would win without ever raising my voice. I wasn't choosing chaos. I was choosing precision. Morning arrived quietly, as if the city itself was giving me space to think. I made coffee slowly, not rushing, letting the routine remind me that time still belonged to me. When I checked my phone, there were 5 missed calls. 2 from my father, 1 from my stepmother, 2 from unknown numbers I didn't recognize but could easily guess. I ignored all of them and opened my email instead. There it was. A confirmation from building management, automated and polite, stating that an additional resident request was under review. No apology, no explanation, just process. I forwarded the email to myself, then opened a new document and began listing facts. Dates, times, access points. I wasn't writing a diary, I was building a record. That's the mistake people like my family make. They think control comes from volume, from pressure, from repetition. But real control comes from documentation. From being able to say, here is exactly what happened, without emotion muddying the edges. Around mid-morning, my father finally left a voicemail. His voice was measured, calm, the tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "You're overreacting," he said. "No one is trying to take anything from you. We just need to think about what's best for everyone." Everyone. The word landed heavily. It always excluded me while pretending to include me. I deleted the message without responding. Type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once, because this wasn't about one confrontation anymore. It was about dismantling an entire pattern, step by step, until there was nothing left for them to hide behind. By noon, I had answers. Building management returned my call with practiced neutrality, the kind that suggests they've seen family disputes turn ugly before. The request to add my stepsister hadn't come from my email directly. It had been submitted through an authorized device linked to my account, using credentials I hadn't used in over a year. That detail mattered. It meant someone hadn't just overstepped emotionally. They'd crossed into impersonation. I thanked the manager calmly and asked for a full access report. When I hung up, I sat very still, letting the implications line up in my head. I remembered lending my tablet to my father months earlier when his phone battery died. remembered him joking about how complicated my security settings were. At the time, I'd laughed. Now, I understood how carefully he'd been paying attention. I drove to the building office in person that afternoon. Not angry, focused. I requested a temporary freeze on all access changes and submitted written notice that no additional residents were authorized under any circumstances. The manager glanced at my face, still faintly marked, then back at the paperwork. "We'll flag the account," he said quietly. "Immediately." On the way out, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from my stepmother. "Your father is beside himself. You're tearing the family apart." I stopped walking and read it twice, not concerned about what had been done to me, concerned about the consequences of me noticing. I typed one sentence back. "I'm protecting what's mine." Then I blocked the number. For years, they'd relied on my availability, my willingness to listen, my fear of being seen as difficult. That afternoon, as I walked back into my building, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not guilt, not doubt, authority. That evening, I sat at my desk and opened a folder I hadn't touched since moving in. Inside were copies of contracts, old emails, and a handwritten note from my attorney from years back reminding me to always keep originals. I smiled at that. Past me had been careful in ways present me was finally learning to appreciate. I scanned documents into a secure drive, labeling each one clearly. Ownership, purchase history, payment trails. Every fact stood on its own, indifferent to feelings. My father showed up at the building just after sunset. I didn't know at first. I only learned because the concierge called to inform me that a man claiming to be my parent was requesting access. The phrasing was deliberate, claiming. I told them no one was to be admitted without my written approval. The concierge hesitated, then confirmed. Minutes later, my phone rang again. I let it go to voicemail. This time, his voice wasn't calm. It was tight, edged with disbelief. "I don't know who you think you are right now," he said, "but this isn't how family behaves." I listened once. Then I archived the message. I wasn't interested in redefining myself for people invested in misunderstanding me. Instead, I opened another document and began drafting a timeline. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just a clear sequence of events from the wedding onward. When you remove adjectives, the truth becomes very difficult to argue with. I went to bed early that night, not exhausted, but resolved. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes when you stop bracing for impact and start setting terms. The next morning, everything accelerated. Emails arrived from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, each one dressed up as concern. "We heard something happened. Your father is heartbroken. Families make mistakes." None of them asked what had actually occurred. None of them mentioned the slap. They were responding to a version of the story that had already been distributed, one where I was unreasonable and my father was overwhelmed. I didn't reply. I added their messages to my growing archive, timestamps intact. Silence, when documented, speaks loudly later. By late morning, my attorney returned my call. I laid out the facts plainly. No embellishment, no emotional detours. As I spoke, I could hear the shift in her tone from casual to precise. She asked for copies. I sent them immediately. When I finished, there was a brief pause on the line. "You understand," she said carefully, "that what you're describing isn't a family disagreement. It's attempted misrepresentation." I told her I understood perfectly. That was the point. After we hung up, I stood by the window and watched a delivery truck maneuver awkwardly into the loading zone below. Life kept moving. People kept assuming tomorrow would look like yesterday. They were wrong. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about ending access, about making sure the word no finally meant something. Share this video so communities understand what was hiding, because situations like this survive in private and fall apart in daylight. I wasn't interested in being pitied. I wanted the record to exist, clean and undeniable, long after excuses lost their power. By mid-afternoon, the building confirmed in writing that no changes would be made without my in-person authorization. I forwarded that confirmation directly to my attorney and printed a copy for myself. It felt strange how quickly certainty replaced chaos once authority was asserted. The problem had never been complexity. It had been my reluctance to draw a line others couldn't cross. That evening, my stepsister finally reached out again. Not a call, a long message, carefully constructed. She wrote about stress, about how weddings make people emotional, about how Dad didn't mean to hurt me. She said the penthouse wasn't really the point. They just wanted to feel secure starting their life together. The words were gentle, almost reasonable, until you read them closely. Security, in her version, was still something I was supposed to provide. I didn't respond. I saved the message and locked my phone. Later, alone in my living room, I sat with the quiet and felt the weight of something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not because the conflict was over, but because the confusion was. I no longer wondered if I was being unfair. I no longer replayed conversations to see where I could have been softer. The truth was simple. They felt entitled to my stability because they had grown comfortable standing on it. If this shocked you, comment boundaries below, because the most unsettling thing for people like them isn't anger. It's finality. It's realizing the person they underestimated has stopped explaining and started deciding. The formal letter went out the next day. My attorney handled the delivery, precise language on firm letterhead, addressed to my father and stepmother by name. It outlined ownership, documented unauthorized access attempts, and made one thing unmistakably clear. Any further interference would be treated as a legal matter, not a personal one. There was no threat in it, just consequence. I read it once before it was sent, then once after, not for reassurance but for recognition. This was me choosing structure over sentiment. The response was immediate and exactly as expected. My father called, furious now, the calm finally gone. He accused me of overreacting, of humiliating him, of choosing property over blood. I let him speak until he ran out of breath. Then I said one sentence. "You chose control over respect." I ended the call before he could reply. That was the first time I had ever done that. In the days that followed, the noise slowly died down. Fewer messages, fewer calls. The absence was noticeable, almost disorienting, but it was clean. Without constant pressure, I could see how much energy I had been spending managing other people's emotions. I started sleeping better, eating better, thinking clearly. One afternoon, I walked through my penthouse with fresh eyes. It wasn't just a home. It was evidence of work, of restraint, of survival. They had wanted it because it represented independence they couldn't claim. Keeping it wasn't revenge, it was alignment. When people ask now if I regret how far things went, I tell them the truth. Nothing went too far. It simply went where it was always headed once I stopped shrinking. The wedding photos started circulating online a few days later. Perfect smiles, perfect lighting, a narrative of unity so carefully curated it almost looked real. I didn't appear in most of them. In the few where I did, I was cropped at the edge, half out of frame, like an afterthought. I noticed it without reacting. The need to correct the story had left me. People who wanted the truth already knew where to find it. What surprised me was how quickly the family dynamic reorganized itself once I stepped out of my old position. My stepsister stopped posting about new beginnings. My stepmother stopped calling mutual acquaintances to test the waters. My father went quiet altogether. Control doesn't vanish gracefully when it fails. It retreats, wounded, waiting for another opening. I made sure there wouldn't be one. I updated my security again, not because I was afraid, but because vigilance felt like self-respect now. I scheduled regular check-ins with my attorney, not out of paranoia, but out of clarity. I stopped explaining my choices to people who benefited from misunderstanding them. In the space that created, something steadier grew. Confidence without performance, peace without permission. I realized then that revenge, the kind people imagine, is loud and consuming. It keeps you tethered to the very people who wronged you. What I chose was quieter and far more effective. I chose permanence. I chose to remove myself as an option. They could keep their version of events. I kept my life intact. Months later, I ran into someone who had been at the wedding. They hesitated before speaking, then said, "I heard things changed after that night." I nodded, because that was the simplest truth. Things had changed, not because I fought harder, but because I stopped offering myself as collateral. I learned that dignity doesn't announce itself. It shows up when you no longer negotiate your worth. My father never apologized. My stepsister never admitted what she tried to do. In a strange way, that made it easier. Closure doesn't always come from understanding. Sometimes it comes from acceptance. I accepted that the version of family I had hoped for never existed, and in doing so, I stopped chasing it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was spacious. On quiet evenings, I still stand by my windows and watch the city settle into itself. I think about how close I came to giving up something permanent to satisfy something temporary. I think about how many people are taught that love requires sacrifice, but never told who gets to decide what is sacrificed and by whom. What happened to me wasn't unique. It was just visible. And visibility changes things. If this story stayed with you, take a moment now. Like this video, because it helps stories like this reach people who think they're alone. Comment below and tell me, what would you have done in my place? And subscribe, not for drama, but because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind you that choosing yourself isn't betrayal. It's survival.